morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good, thank you. Not supposed to ask you for any other response, so got to live within the rules. Welcome to, and I quote, the student success quagmire, Vietnam-era word, higher education's continued pursuit of innovation solutions to drive student success outcomes. We know you had other destinations to choose from in this hour. We appreciate your being with us. I'm John Gardner. I am the co-founder of the Institute for Excellence in Undergraduate Education and Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the original USC, the University of South Carolina, and founding director there of the National Resource Center for the First Year Experience of Students in Transition. You'll hear from my colleagues in just a minute. Like to practice something immediately, though, for their benefit. It'll help them, I know, as it will me. Like to practice something immediately I learned in Speech 101, in which my final grade was a D. My only preparation for doing this morning, something called audience analysis. Like to know, just a show of some appendage, about your role. How many of you are higher educators? Do you actively work at in the institutional level? Okay, thank you. How many of you are providers of solutions and services to support higher educators? Okay, welcome. How many of you are investors? Okay, thank you. Philanthropists. I'm not sure there's a difference between investors and philanthropists, but we'll say the tax difference, I guess. Any other category you want to self-identify as? Okay, thank you. Now, my colleagues on the panel, let me start with you, Lori. All we're asked to do here is name and affiliation.
I'm Lori Redfern. I'm with the California State University.
I'm Pete Wheelan. I'm the CEO of InsideTrack. We're a Strata Education Network company.
Hi, I'm Troy Markowitz, and I'm Vice President of Academic Partnerships at Portfolium.
I'm Preston, Silverman, CEO and co-founder of RaiseMe.
I'm Tim Renick, Vice President for Student Success at Georgia State University in Atlanta.
Tim is also this year's recipient of the McGraw-Hill Prize. I think we ought to recognize him again. And Lori also gets an A+ for flexibility. She was invited yesterday to be on this panel because the original invitee was stranded on a standby list that she never could clear in Rhode Island. And so we appreciate, Lori, your flexibility.
My pleasure.
I'm going to make some very brief remarks about the context of this session, and then each of the panelists will make briefer initial statements about how they see this context. And then we're going to address a number of questions. We are going to very specifically address such statements as what do we mean by student success, which is the focus of this session. We're going to address what is needed to achieve student success, whatever that is. We're going to ask who has the answers to this quagmire. We're going to ask what's new, what's working, and also is there a Holy Grail of student success? And hopefully we'll get to the real key question. What are the prospects for higher education for saving itself or being saved by others externally? Okay? So that's what we intend to do. In Speech 101, that's called an outline. Now, for the context, ladies and gentlemen, this relentless search, as we've referenced in the session description, is nothing new. This has been going on since the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862. It's been going on since the Veterans Readjustment Bill of 1947, after World War II, reissued now over 3 successive wars, and it's also been going on with much greater intensity since the Higher Education Act of 1965. It also was moved to a more operational, programmatic level by work that I coined in the early 80s known as the first year experience. We originally called it freshman year, but we got rid of that sexist language because students, many of them do not have a first year and most of them are not fresh. The one word that seems to capture all of this now is the dreaded R word on our campus is the word retention. We might want to ask, is this perennial challenge being replaced by new wine in old bottles? The panelists, I'm sure, will reflect on this. I'd like to observe that most of us that are doing this work on the campus are staff or administrators on whom this duty has been imposed by very nervous, anxious chief executive officers, chancellors, presidents, et cetera, which means that most of the people doing this work are those that respond to fiat, direct orders, and who do not have tenure, i.e. the faculty. The big shift in this work right now is to get the faculty much more engaged because ultimately they have more contact with the students we wish to make successful than any other member of the academy. For your information, retention, first to second year retention is essentially flat in our country. Approximately 75% of first-year students in baccalaureate institutions return for a second year, 50% in community colleges. We can and we must do better. We would not be doing nearly as well were it not for a number of the student success initiatives you're going to hear described. Now, we need to make sure you all understand what I'm going to describe as the perfect storm on our campuses that invites interventions by all those in the academy and outside the academy. What are the components in the perfect storm? The first is the dramatic decline in the number of Americans who can quantifiably define themselves as being the members of the middle class. We're very good at producing poor people in the United States. We're producing more of them daily, and they are not the traditional population we were designed to serve. Another factor is that these students, the poor, of course, are much more disproportionately low income. This is accompanied by the growing legislative hostility at the state level to funding public higher education, and it's coupled, therefore, with dramatic increases in tuition costs being passed on to the students and their families. This, in turn, is combined by the increasing reluctance of our working consumers to support their children at expensive colleges and universities. They can no longer use their home as an ATM. The challenge here is further compounded by the economic recovery, which is driving more students into the workforce initially than to our college campuses. Again, this is further compounded by the drastic out-migration of students in the Northeast and the upper Midwest, and the declining birth rates, particularly in those regions that have been exacerbated by the Great Recession. The declining birth rates, that is, in the population sector that historically sent the most students to college. Another dimension of the student success quagmire is the dire straits that the several thousand small private liberal arts colleges are faced with. Many are predicting doom for this sector. I'm not sure I buy it. They're hard to kill off. Another key factor is the increasing pressures for accountability from regional accreditors and funders, especially state governments. And this falls especially heavily on the leaders of our institution, now many of whose contracts are pay-for-performance basis, and they're influenced by the metrics in state systems, particularly for retention and graduation rates, which is a component of student success. So that's the basic picture on the perfect storm, and we enter this much more recently in the past decade with the technologies that have moved us beyond the overhead projector, thank you, and Gutenberg's invention of movable type. All right, so we're going to move now to having a statement of context, which may or may not fit in with mine. That's okay. We all have academic freedom here, right? Lori, let's start with you. How you see the context of this student success performance.
So one of the things that I didn't share in my introduction is I'm Assistant Vice Chancellor for System-Wide Advancement for the 23 California State University campuses. So one of the questions may be, why is someone in fundraising and alumni relations interested in student success? And part of the way that I frame that context is that students and alumni are the same person. They're just at different places in their journey through the university. So we have a very profound interest in student success, primarily because student success ultimately equates to a generous donor, right? We want students that have rich, fulfilling experiences that develop pride and gratitude in the university and lead them to that successful career. So when they have that success, they are willing to give up their hard-earned dollars to reinvest in students for the next generation.
Thank you. Pete?
I'll just jump in by saying when the title of the panel first came through as the Quagmire, I kind of knew in general what a quagmire meant, but I actually looked it up, and it's a seemingly impossible situation that sounds difficult from which to extract yourself. And I thought, why are we calling student success that? But it actually summarizes it pretty well, which is it's an absolute imperative, and it's really, really hard. And I think a lot of the dialogue touches on various different angles that I'm sure we'll cover in terms of strategic alignment across various different groups within the institution, human capital. There are people in advising and student affairs and various elements of the institution that need to be coordinating and have certain elements of professional development and training, and then the technology piece. And if you're only working on one out of the three, it's likely that the results are not going to be kind of what you want them to be.
Troy?
Sure. So when I first saw the title of this, I asked about 10 colleagues and also 10 people here while I was here, what is the definition of student success to you? What does it mean to you? And I got 10 different answers. It was affordability, it was graduation retention and persistence, it was post-graduation, it was engagement, it was engaging in student affairs and student life activities. So I think it's a mixture of that, and we'll talk about this later in the panel, where the shift from these silos needing to connect from all parts of the campus to fuel this interwoven student success from faculty to student life to alumni and advancement and student affairs. But more attention is on this more than ever. I work with many states. One state, for example, in the state of Texas has a strategic 60 by 30 plan where they're needing to prove that students are graduating career ready. So from my standpoint, I wanted to emphasize on this panel specifically the career readiness element of not just getting students to graduate, but having them graduate and proving that they are ready to enter the workforce with the skills and the competencies that the workforce is demanding. But more important, having them find relevance to the learning, having them find learning relevance from student life to understand that they are indeed acquiring skills and competencies through the very learning from completing an assignment in the class, through a student life activity like a co-curricular transcript. The more that they're aware, and I call this a skill awareness gap instead of the skills gap, the more that they'll find value to the program and the degree, and the better they'll be able to articulate their skills and competencies when it matters, from a career fair event or an interview.
Thank you, Troy. Preston?
The only thing that I would add on top of what my colleagues have said already and is relevant for us is the role that financial aid can play in this process. We believe financial aid is a driver of a lot of student dropout, and some of the worst outcomes are when students start and stop and drop out without the degree that's going to help them get the better paying job. So that's where we see ourselves playing most and where I hope to comment.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, we know that 75% of the students who leave us without completing their credential leave us voluntarily. We're not suspending them, and financial difficulties is the most socially acceptable answer that they give us for leaving. Whether or not it's the real reason or not, we don't know, but respect what you're doing about this too, Preston, your own work. Tim?
Yeah, if we're going to talk about the perfect storm, it hasn't hit every place simultaneously. So one of the reasons we've been pressed to innovate a lot at Georgia State is we were an early location for a lot of these demographic shifts. You know, over the last 15 years, we've moved from a predominantly white, middle-class institution to one now that has one of the largest low-income populations in the country. We enroll about 26,000 Pell students every semester, about 60% of our total population. Just to put that in some perspective, the entire Ivy League combined this semester is enrolling about 9,800 Pell students. So, you know, we're trying to educate 3 times the number of low-income students as the Ivy League combined. And we're also dealing with, you know, ethnic and racial shifts as well. We're now officially designated an MSI, minority-serving institution. About 67% of our students are non-white. And, you know, for me, the context that's important here is recognize not just those shifts require transformative differences on our campuses, but those shifts are coming across the country. And if they haven't hit your state or city yet, they soon will. And we need to get prepared for that shift.
You want to tell them quickly about your consolidation that only makes your situation more complex?
Yeah, about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, the state of Georgia consolidated Georgia State University, this large 4-year institution in downtown Atlanta, with the largest community college in the state of Georgia, Georgia Perimeter College, which enrolls 20,000 associate degree seeking students. They did so in part because we've succeeded with low-income populations and students of color, and most of the students who are enrolled at Perimeter College were and are low-income first generation and students of color. But it does add a whole new challenge for how can we leverage the cutting-edge technologies that in the past may have been available at the best resourced institution across the whole post-secondary sector, so all students can benefit. Because it's the students who are at the least well-resourced institutions who most need these kind of advantages.
We note the euphemism. It was not a merger, it was a consolidation, right?
It was indeed, yes. That's, that is the claim. But now we have one of our colleges at Georgia State, among, you know, the College of Business and College of Arts and Sciences, is a very large associate degree granting college, which is Perimeter College.
Yes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, so far we want to make sure you all had the opportunity for a perspective from each of the panelists. Because of the extraordinary time limitation here, probably not everyone will be able to speak to every question, but we're going to do as much as we can to hear from as many of you as possible on each question. The first question we want to start with was an operational definition of student success. Apparently, we're all on the same planet here. We've come together to try to increase this. So what is it? You're talking to a client or a colleague
I'll
about
jump in to
student
say
success?
I don't
What is
think
it?
there's a single definition, but I think it's one of the challenges that most institutions face when they create a student success initiative or a student success group is lack of alignment around exactly what are they trying to achieve. And often it's the first time that individuals and or groups across that institution have come together on that dialogue. And oftentimes there's a lot of disagreement around the baseline that you're trying to move or even the metric from which you're trying to have a baseline. But that's in the dialogue that we have with institutions at a starting point. It's really trying to drive that clarity for this program, for this institution, for this initiative. How are you defining student success? Because there are a wide variety of definitions. Certainly, some elements of them have to come back to presumably completion, and presumably what happens after that completion in terms of the value associated with the time spent in that program. But there are a lot of interim metrics to lead to those, and there are a lot of different ways to measure those big picture outcomes.
Pete, you've used several terms interchangeably, program, initiative. Many of us who work in this field feel that one of the major challenges is that institutions are approaching this as a function of program and initiative and not a comprehensive design for student success that would bring in the whole institution. I know that's one of the factors that's part of your success, Tim, but we're all working to contribute to that kind of a plan. Troy?
I can define it by providing access and removing barriers for access to school, affordability, engagement, getting students to graduate, but there's a lot within for that to work. And I call it more of an intentional journey and pathway that students need to take as soon as they enter, as soon as they step foot on the campus. They need to know they all can't be engaged in the same way, meaning a first-generation college student might need to be engaged differently than a different cohort. And so the topic of engagement needs to be more tactical, more customized, and well-received in a digital way so that the students have a call to action, so that they know while going through first-year experience, they're developing critical thinking and problem-solving and leadership and teamwork. The value of that, they need a place to showcase that, to reflect upon it as well as they continue to their journey through major and career exploration, through completion of student affairs and student life activities for co-curricular transcript, and then later on as well as they enter into career services, obtain an internship. And what I just said, it's going through the entire student life cycle, but it's also going through many sectors of the campus, from academic advisors and first-year experience through student success, through academic affairs in the class and student affairs, and also career services, and then alumni and advancement. So the shift needs to happen where they're more interconnected, and these as silos of excellence, as I call them, are bridged together to help the student thrive.
And I'll follow up on that in saying that at the California State University, I think for the past decade, we really focused on the incoming funnel, working on that access and opportunity piece. But now we're looking at that, how do we get them to completion? How do we get them to the finish line? How do we improve our graduation rates? And that's helped us really start to collect the data that helps us identify what are the barriers that students are facing to get to that finish line. How can we have first-year experiences, high-impact practices, access to undergraduate research, internships, mentorships, community service learning, those opportunities that make the education relevant to students and help them be inspired to make it to graduation.
I'll mention briefly that, 1970, it was about 5 times more likely that a student from the upper 25% of Americans by annual household income would hold a college degree than somebody from the bottom 25%. 2018, it's now about 10 times more likely that somebody from the upper income level will hold a college degree than the lower income. So I think we can't be successful as a post-secondary sector until we address those achievement gaps. We're not going to succeed with the promises we make for our students and their families. We're also going to not succeed with the commitments that our communities make to us until we address that issue.
Tim, if we're all going to make America great again, we absolutely have to do something about that. We cannot continue as a democracy to continue to tolerate that. And that's why, Troy, you mentioned that you used the adjective intentional.
Yeah.
One of the key themes here is that you, down with serendipity, you can't leave to chance the things that students most need to be successful. You've got to be very deliberate about it, which means you got to get everything on the table about what it is they need, which is our next question. What is needed? If you want to increase student success, what is needed? Very specifically, concretely, panelists. What are you doing to deliver?
It starts with being deeply in touch with the student. So what are the channels of communication that you have opened with that student when? I mean, I know, one of the things you introduced as a question is who has the answers with regard to student success. The student ultimately has the answers in terms of what he or she is struggling with, what their perception is of that program, of that institution. What we find in a lot of institutions is there's not a real communication channel that is soliciting the broader feedback from that student. There's a lot of times there's a lot of one-way outreach, which is you haven't registered yet. Can you register? You're on financial hold. Can you get off? Put down the phone and you're done. But the multiple communication channels with the student that enable them to consume information at the pace that they want to consume information and have the ability to get action or acknowledgement or a resolution when they want it is really, really critical. Because they'll help you define it as they go. And then the higher level answers is also going to depend significantly by program and by institution.
This stressing of communication reminds me of an example, Tim, that I read recently. You've done some work at Georgia State using the kind of technology that some of these people have created to increase communication with your students, right?
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I value this meeting, because I think the way that we're going to begin to deliver these personalized services to students is through collaborations with technology, and in many cases with the for-profit sector. So in the case of communication, we're having huge issues with what they call summer melt, the problem of students graduating from high school, parting ways with their high school counselors, and then having 3 months before they start college. And in some urban areas, as many as 20% of the students, not who graduate from high school, but who graduate from high school, get into college and confirm they're attending, just melt away during those summer months. So 2 years ago, we launched a chatbot with a startup at MidHub, and we began a smart platform, an AI-enhanced automatic texting platform to give students the answers that they need in those 3 months before they actually arrive on campus. And as I mentioned this morning, the first 3 months we had that platform launched, we had over 200,000 questions answered to our incoming freshmen. Average response time was 7 seconds. When we did the random control trial, we found that the students who were from underserved backgrounds benefited the most. When we did the qualitative analysis, we found that many of those students admitted that they asked questions of the chatbot they were reluctant to ask of a human being because they were embarrassed about the fact that they didn't know where dad was to sign the FAFSA form or other things like that. So we need to do those sorts of things, not only because they work, and we reduced in 1 year summer melt at Georgia State by about 20%, but because they're scalable, because they're the type of answer that can be used across the sector, even at institutions that are resource poor, but those are precisely the institutions that enroll the greatest number of first-generation and low-income students.
Great illustration. What else do they need besides enhanced communication?
That's exactly what we've seen as well, is that every student is coming in from a very different background and will leave with a very different path. And so we have to think about how can we create personalized experiences for students at scale that remove barriers for them and give them increased motivation and support along the way. And I think technology can just be a tool to provide the educators and the institutions doing the hard work ways to do this more seamlessly and more scalably. We've seen at RaiseMe by providing students with frameworks and goals and milestones that they are then empowered to achieve, that it gives them much more autonomy over their journey, and we're seeing similar changes in outcomes as a result. Students that are retaining, melting at lower rates.
I think we're already segueing to who has, maybe it's a matter of who and what might be answers to these student needs that might increase their probability of being successful. Don't be modest here. Yeah?
I would say, in one respect, faculty. So I talk to many campuses at Portfolium across the country, and we talk about student success, and I often ask our faculty involved, and I often don't don't hear that as a positive, that they are. And they need to be, and they should, and we're seeing a lot of success on many campuses where faculty are empowered to be involved with the Student Success Initiative, with arming students in the class where they are the most, with the skills and the competencies, and for them to find relevance to what they're learning from their general ed program and other programs for outside the class as well, so that they could track and map and reflect and articulate those skills, and of course find value. That Strata Education Network just came out with a recent article about relevance and about students who find relevance to what they're studying will persist, and they'll be able to leverage that when it comes to finding a job. And I think awareness. We need to meet the students where they are the most, and they are in the class. They're connected to the learning management system and other systems too that need to be interoperable, which we could talk more in details with. But from my perspective, faculty play an integral part in student success.
If I may speak for you, Tim, the two faculty members on the panel appreciate that. Let's all be reminded that the faculty have had experience for over 1,000 years, since the year 1067 and the founding of the University of Bologna, in obstructing any change we don't like and advancing those we do. Okay, so just a subtle reminder.
Yeah.
Okay?
But I'll give a shout out to Troy. We've been a partner with Troy's company, Portfolium, for 3 years now, and you know, the faculty are critical. But what we need to do is leverage technologies in smart ways to be able to scale across the student body. In the case of career services, it's an overwhelming challenge for Georgia State. We've got 52,000 students enrolled every semester, most low income, most underserved, most students of color. How do you find enough people and time and resources to meet with these students one-on-one? So one of the things we've done with Troy's technology is create e-based portfolios for every student as they enter the university. And then in our first year programs, one of the things that we require students to do is begin to post artifacts, evidence of what they're learning in those portfolios. Last year alone, we had 700,000 postings. Students posted 700,000 artifacts onto their e-portfolios. So we don't have the time to meet with every student, one-on-one for an hour here, an hour here, an hour here. But we do have time to get them to think and get their faculty members in those classes to think more proactively about how we can prepare students for that first job and for that first career and beyond.
So you're really a bearer of optimism, aren't you, that we can do better?
I absolutely am. I mean, tough times, economically. We've faced SAT scores going down by 33 points over the last decade. At the same time, we've raised our graduation rates by 22 percentage points and closed all achievement gaps. So, Georgia State is not in any favored position by any alignment of the stars. We're in a tough state when it comes to higher education. Georgia is not a high-performing state with public education. The resources have been dwindling. And, if we can do it, then the challenge to, especially my counterparts in the room from the post-secondary sector is why can't we do these things more broadly?
You're really moving to the related question and focus of what's new here. And I want to put that question in perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, you all know that the history of higher education was originally an oral tradition. The only way students could learn anything was by having people verbally recite the knowledge that retained by previous generations. Gutenberg supposedly changed that with the invention of movable type in the 16th century. But it didn't change the primary pedagogy used in universities until our current times. So we need to be looking for new approaches. What do you all want to recommend that you haven't already? Approaches to achieve student success.
Well, part of it is taking a holistic approach to student success. We're dealing with student populations that have homelessness and food insecurity, and making sure that they know where they're going to get their next meal is important so that they can focus on their learning environment. Helping to have those opportunities to meet students where they are in the learning experience, and providing them with that personalized intervention when they need it. Using technology to identify when students need help with math labs or writing labs or other types of supplemental learning. And so technology is helping us in all of those ways, and then we're using tools like Portfolium to archive those skills and competencies for our students, making them more competitive for the workforce. And faculty are coming along. They're seeing it as an opportunity to ease their way in doing assessment. And our first adopters were the students because they saw the value of the network and the ability to have kind of a visual representation of their work and their resume. And now faculty are really starting to become the drivers.
And they can make those compilations of their experiences available to employers? It's
Yes,
portable?
absolutely. And we're making those connections with employers by working with our industry councils and our alumni and having them integrate into the system their job opportunities, their internship opportunities, and helping to make those connections.
Talk about scale. Let's all remember that this colleague of ours is in the advancement work for California State University. You got 24 campuses and how many 100,000 students?
450,000 students, maybe 470,000 students.
Pretty soon you're talking real numbers there. Thank you very much.
I'd say one of the things that I'm seeing and hearing that's new is that as technology, there's been more and more technology available per, things that every person has referenced, whether it's communication channels, predictive analytics, et cetera. But the dialogue around, you can't just parachute that into an institution. I mean, you're parachuting it into existing human beings and existing processes and existing incentives. And I'm hearing more dialogue around organization design and actually, how do you tackle that issue? I mean, if you do have, data in 9 different places across that student journey, and to your point, some of the answers of what to do from a student success point are in there, but they're locked in 9 different places, either from a systemic standpoint or incentive standpoint, the data's not being shared. That's kind of an organization design issue around incentives and change management. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about is change management. And Tim, I've heard you, in detail go through the work that you've done there. And I love how you talk about the early days of, there's some element of burning the bridges and saying, we can't point to broken families. We can't, point to, things out of our control. We need to look back at ourselves and saying, what are we doing?
So do you see it as part of your role, not only in providing a solution to help us organize ourselves better so that we can actually more effectively use that solution?
Well, absolutely, to surface those issues at minimum, because I think they're critical. I mean, I think there are a ton of technologies walking around this conference over the last 2 or 3 days that in and of themselves work, technology, the widget, whatever it is. But again, you're dropping it into an ecosystem that potentially would reject it even though it works because there's an old way of doing things and or my incentives are aligned to do something else.
Are you finding my campus colleagues receptive to your willingness to do that?
Absolutely, but it often requires a significant amount of leadership commitment from
What's your
and
secret
uniformity
sauce?
from the
What's
top.
your secret sauce? How are you getting to be so receptive?
I don't think there's any secret sauce. I think there's, pointing to Tim and his success, which I love to do, is how do you put as much of the problem on the table and confront as much reality as possible. And if part of that means there's an organization design issue here, you got to tackle it. If part of it means that you've had an advisor or mentoring or coaching team that hasn't received professional development and training in 10 years, you should potentially look at professional development and training. If there's technology and a partner that can help you automate something, help you get more out of that human capital that you already have, absolutely, embrace it. But I think a recurring theme are, quote, failed implementations of technology. And oftentimes it's, when you look deeply, it's not the technology doesn't work, it's that the thought process around what are we dropping that technology into is the key issue.
I'm really aware of the forced burden here of the time constraint, and I do want to ask you all to be thinking about, I'm going to get to your, whatever it is you want to say, but I'd like to ask the panelists to be thinking about the next question. I'd like each of you to identify, if you could, one thing you haven't mentioned. Well, you may have mentioned it, but I want you to share with this audience one thing, one intervention you think is really working, okay? And, don't feel you have to be modest here, but one thing you want them all to know about that's really working, as succinctly as you can state that. And we'll do that after you've spoken. Okay?
Give them some time to think.
Yes.
Yeah. And,
They may or may not need
The only
that,
thing I would
okay?
add to Pete is, on top of that, I think it's for us technology providers, upon us to really think about how can we make these solutions as easily adoptable as possible for an institution. It's very hard when institutions are working at this scale to get everyone bought in, and so we need to think about the consumerification of the technology to make it as simple and easy to use for every single educator and every single student, and make it easy for them to pilot programs as well at a smaller scale, and then grow from there. Because we see when solutions are able to be adopted from more of a bottoms-up way, and it's really seamless for people, the institutions and the leaders that are promoting those solutions are able to be much more successful.
So we should all remember and practice the acronym KISS, keep it simple, stupid?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, the issues we're trying to address and the systems, Pete, as you've been pointing out, are enormously complex in and of themselves. And if you introduce a technology that, or some other intervention that also in and of itself is hugely complicated, it's not often a recipe for adoption and scaling. Okay, let me, I don't care who starts, but I'd like to get one recommendation of something that's working from each of you. Troy?
So I would say the theme of what's working is that outcomes are connected across an entire campus. Although there's different outcomes and requirements from a faculty standpoint for measuring student learning outcomes and accreditation, then you have your co-curricular transcript outcomes, and then the career readiness outcomes from career services and alumni advancement, experiential learning. I can go on with this list of outcomes, but what I'm finding success with our partners is that they're interconnecting all of them together. So instead of keeping data that's siloed, they're leveraging technology and interoperability. There's organizations like IMS Global that's creating the standard for the LTI connection between these technologies to not keep data that's siloed, to help recycle that data. For instance, the measurement of student learning. There's skills that are underlying, like critical thinking and problem solving and leadership and teamwork, that employers say they have a hard time finding. Those can surface, again, going back to the skill awareness gap to the student, finding relevance from their learning. Same thing with student life and student affairs. So just to sum it up, the outcomes, although separate in nature, perhaps even acquired in a siloed fashion from a department or college or program, can be interconnected, and we're doing that. We're seeing huge benefit to that too. I remember Dr. Timothy Renick, you had said that there's no such thing as bad data. And making those data-driven decisions is important to find opportunities for improvement and gaps, so that instead of just looking at the learning management system as activities and students submitting work, we should look at it as a learning success management system in terms of being able to measure the output, the outcomes, students finding relevance, and then always thinking about the student first. How is the student going to benefit in a tangible way and take this with them in a portable way so it doesn't lock when they graduate, helping them unlock as it pertains to their scope of interest, which is getting a good job, but also massaging the needs of all the other outcomes across an entire campus.
Okay. Thank you, Troy. Laurie?
And I'll follow up on that, in that I think in intervention, I don't know if we call it specifically an intervention, but what is working for us is better use of data and understanding what are the barriers that students are facing, whether that is a lack of a number of courses for them to make their way through, whether it's the curriculum itself that has been too challenging, and we can identify through data where are they asking questions the most? How can we reframe the way that we're providing teaching so that we're getting past that barrier? Are they moving between different degrees, and is that causing them to be with us for numerous years and not make their way to graduation? So I think that it's being smarter about all of the information that we have and being able to use it in ways that evidence that this isn't working, and so we need to change it and to take the bold step to change it. One of the bold steps we took was to reframe our remedial education, that we wanted to make sure that students were taking courses that were giving them credit towards graduation, that weren't holding them back, that weren't putting them in the frame set that they weren't ready and prepared for college, but really reframing that to challenge them to get up to a skills level. And that was a big deal to change something that was a big part of our curriculum at the university.
Also, there's a lot of risk involved there, and I'm sorry to say that, but sometimes you want to do things, but you may be sued if you do it. And there you are. For those of us who do not live in the country of California, we may not have heard of a unique barrier that you've got a unique term to describe. And this is what are known as impacted courses. And impacted courses are courses for which the student demand far exceeds the capacity of the institution to provide which is one of the critical factors that delays or increases time to degree completion rates.
Right, and we want to
That's-
make sure that they have
Yeah.
authentic access to their degrees. We don't just want to enroll them and then not have the
And take their
coursework
money and
available
their
for
hope.
them.
Yeah. Thank you, Lori.
One example of the use of data that Lori's talking about, and it actually connects with some of Preston's work. Preston and RaiseMe doing really creative work in trying to use financial aid, especially to help access issues, getting students into college. We had a problem at the other end of the spectrum. As we enrolled more and more low-income students and retained more of them through the process, we began dropping over 1,000 students a semester because they couldn't cover their tuition and fees. And the problem with a lot of the aid programs nationally, including our biggest state scholarship in Georgia, the Hope Scholarship, is they're limited by time. And the Hope Scholarship covers 4 years. So you have students doing everything right, but because they're working jobs and maybe they failed a course or two along the way or had to withdraw from some classes, they're running out of their aid right before they graduated. So of those 1,000 students we were dropping every semester, this was 6 years ago, the biggest single group were seniors. Students, by definition, within 2 semesters of graduating. So we started a program that was radical at the time, what we call them Panther retention grants after our school mascot. We just started giving students the money. We would look at students who were plugging away, taking the right courses. Even if their GPA was only a 2.0, they qualified and were close to graduating. And if they owed under $1,500, we didn't ask them to come into any office or sign any form. We just put it into their account. First semester, we did that for 40 students. First semester, we did that for 40 students, and over the last 5 years, we've given over 12,000 of those grants out. Last year alone, almost 1,500 of the students who graduated from Georgia State were recipients of these grants. And in part through the support of the Gates Foundation, Boston Consulting Group came in and said, let's take a look at this program because it's really effective. 80% of the students who get one of these grants that average $900 are graduating within 2 semesters. But what is it costing the institution? And after looking at all our data and spending several weeks on campus, Boston Consulting Group came up with the calculus that this makes money for the institution. Because instead of students walking away with their tuition dollars, they're actually staying enrolled for a couple more semesters and paying us back. So there's a program that really works, and I'm confident that there should be a model where we can spread that much more widely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tim, for that inspiration. We need that as a country. 2 more examples of what's working. Pete, you look like you want to
Well,
speak.
I'll go back to the, I think having as many, well, as a strategic and logical plan for open communication channels with the student, leveraging technology as much as possible, but also integrating across technology. So a student should be able to, yes, still walk into a physical office if that is his or her preference, pick up the phone if that's his or her preference, receive a phone call, but also get, relevant, time-sensitive information, potentially on a mobile app, potentially via text, and potentially in a way that doesn't feel random, and or that it's in the institution's best interest. I got a text because I'm on financial hold, please get off. It's the first time I've ever gotten a text from anybody. And the best way to put in place those channels and have that student, kind of tethered for the experience is as early as possible. Back when, Tim, I love the program that is designed around reducing summer melt, building upon that in terms of that's now a positive experience they've had interacting, whether it's a chatbot or whether it's a human behind a chatbot, can they go to that the next time that they're going to hit the inevitable hurdle in their student journey? And I think those open communication channels are, provide 2 critical aspects that fuel a bunch of other initiatives. One is it provides what we call little data, right? There's a lot of talk out there about big data and how can you look at the SIS and the LMS and any other acronym and pull, predictive analytics from various things. But if you're in touch with a student, you're going to know exactly what's going on with that specific student, regardless of what's going on with their SIS data, regardless of what socioeconomic class they come from, what they look like. You're going to find out that their car broke down, and that's why they didn't register, because they didn't have the money. Then you deal with that issue, and they become that person in that problem. So the little data becomes incredibly powerful to act on. And then those communication channels become the way that you can actually drive action from the insight that's coming from the data. So data is fantastic, but data is only as good as the insight that you can kind of draw from it and the action you can take on the insight. And that's where I see oftentimes a lot of breakdown. Gathering a whole lot of data doesn't necessarily fix anything.
Okay, thank you. And Preston.
Yeah, I was also going to point to innovations in financial aid, and I think Tim illustrated that better than anyone could, and the work they've done has been amazing. But I'd say layering on top of just the added dollars that you can get from retaining the tuition is, as we see more and more states move towards performance-based funding, there's increased ROI for the institution layered on top of that. But in addition to that, I would say something that I heard recently that I thought was interesting and was passed along was work that Stanford did as they were trying to think about how do they have their first-year students retain and succeed academically at a better rate. And they had crowdsourced videos from all their students across the campus that was essentially created a welcome video for students. And the message wasn't so much that Stanford's going to be the best time ever. It was really about Stanford's going to be hard, and this is going to push you and challenge you, but you're going to dig deep and you will overcome these. And when they shared these videos out, what they saw was that it had a market effect for, particularly for underrepresented minorities and first-generation college students on their first-year retention and first-year GPAs. So I think, just small interventions like that can be really powerful.
I want to ask these 5 very thoughtful people to answer what is meant seriously as a question, because I know all of us hear it. And I want them to answer it in one word, and I'm going to give them the 2 words that they have to choose from: yes or no. And I want to set this up in the following way. We all are influenced by our own personal and professional histories. And in the 1960s, I invented sliced bread. I got this idea that if you could actually teach students how to be successful, if you wanted, you could build a course around it. And I never dreamed that what we were creating for students could be used ultimately to save faculty. Now, I mention this because there's a desperation out here in this student success work. And specifically now, in disciplines where enrollments are declining dramatically, we are now reassigning faculty, like in the discipline of history. In 2 months, I've worked with 3 campuses that are reassigning history faculty in order to save their tenured slots to teach college success. God forbid, all right? Now, you can believe that people at those institutions are so desperate. They are asking, is there a Holy Grail to achieve student success? So I want to each ask the 5 of you, is there a Holy Grail?
No.
Thank you.
No.
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 Let me make it 6.
Was that
okay?
helpful?
All right, so we have consensus on that, and I think that's really a way of saying that this is an extraordinarily multifaceted, complex challenge we're facing. So what are the prospects that we can get our act together in the academy with help from inside and outside and save ourselves from ourselves? What do you think? Tim, are you optimistic about this?
I am optimistic. I mean, I think there are all kinds of possibilities today that didn't exist 5 or 6 years ago. If you look at what have been the really impactful programs we've initiated, we couldn't be tracking 52,000 students for 800 different risk factors 5, 6 years ago. That was not a technology that was in our reach, or we couldn't afford it. We couldn't have been doing an AI-enhanced chatbot. We couldn't have been creating e-portfolios for students, allowing them to enter 700,000 different artifacts from all different media and so forth. So these are new, next-generation movements in higher education. I'm very optimistic that they and what comes next can have huge impact on students.
Well, thank you for your role of being both a prophet and a disciple of this. We need that.
Well, I'm also optimistic because I think that the coalition of the willing is growing. I think that more...
Careful how you use that phrase. Remember what happened the last time we...
I don't know. I wasn't here the last time. So, but I think that we're starting to break down some of the silos, right? So we're starting to have different areas of the university work together and really being laser focused on student success and reframing the work that we do in each of our areas and how that impacts student success and how that betters the work that we're doing.
There is a device on the floor staring. It strikes terror in my heart. We have 54 seconds to hear from 3 more of you.
I'm optimistic as well. It's just really hard work. I was in an event a week or 2 ago with a college president who he said, look, everything that has driven his decisions over the last 3 or 4 years has been the mantra of don't let a good crisis go to waste, and meaning he's used it to drive a lot of the changes within the institution alongside technology that are these things that are hard, performance management and professional development and training and change management and organization design. If things are humming along well, those are incredibly hard things to prioritize. If things are getting increasingly pressure-filled, whether internally or externally or from an economic standpoint, it's the time to change.
Thank you. 6 seconds, each of you.
I'm very optimistic. I see a lot of change where there's tools being acquired by universities that are resonating with students better. Instead of just relying on face-to-face time, they're getting mobile notifications. We're meeting them where they are. They're connected to tools that they often use. And they're discovering that their major doesn't always equal what they're going to do after graduation. That someone who's majoring in engineering can work at Goldman Sachs in their derivatives department, or someone who's in liberal studies can also work in tech as well. So I'm seeing great strides with that.
You get the last word?
I'm very optimistic. We see leaders making difficult decisions. They're having hard conversations that need to be had, and so I've been extremely inspired by the university leaders we're working with, and think there's a lot of progress to be had.
Well, panelists, I hope you feel like you actually attended the session that we designed in the abstract before we got together. Thank you all very much, and for you coming at the last one.
Thank you.